Hello, my fantastic Paradigms English 12 students. As we are done reading Good Country People, it is time to analyze the short story by Flannery O'Connor. Hopefully, you've taken some good notes and really read the story with some depth, right? If we just read things on the surface, we can't really taste it, is kind of my analogy. And I've got a slide here that is kind of pertains to that here. This is it's a quote I believe I made up on my own. I don't think I've ever heard anyone else say this. But my idea of reading without analyzing is like eating without tasting. Analyzing is part of reading. It's just an innate part of reading. If you're just reading on the surface, you're not getting the depth and the breadth of what is possible. So at the end of this lesson, I want you to be able to say yes to the following I can statements. And these I can statements are things that you're going to be showing me that you can answer yes to. So you're going to be showing me these skills at some point here in our unit. So here are the following I can statements. I can identify at least two man versus man conflicts in the short story Good Country People by Flannery O'Connor. I can explain how man versus man conflicts in the story contribute to the overall plot development. I can show my understanding of the deeper themes and messages conveyed in the man versus man conflicts in the story, and I can evaluate the resolution of man versus man conflicts and I should say their impact on the story's outcomes. I'm going to change that while I'm here. All right. In your first PDF or set of slides in that PDF I gave you before you read the story, this chart appears. And this chart is going to become important as we go along in the unit because it's going to be part of what's on our unit final. And it's just an important thing to remember when we are exploring literature. So the man versus man motif is a type of conflict in which two or more characters have opposing goals, opposing views, opposing beliefs, or opposing values, which come into conflict with one another. And the central focus of man versus man revolves around tension that's created through arguments, through confrontations, maybe even physical fighting in some cases. And a resolution needs to be sought by characters working through their misunderstandings or through one character triumphing over another. Maybe that's a physical duel or fight or something like that. But it also can be metaphorical. And it's mainly metaphorical in the short story Good Country People. The storyline is often portrayed as a difference in social status, cultural background, or personal ideologies. I think all three of those are true in this story. Social status definitely plays a part. Cultural background, if you look at it in terms of not necessarily like race, but for sure religion and for sure cultural background in the Deep South and the different value systems in the Deep South at the time this was written. And then, of course, personal ideologies come into play quite a bit in this story. All right, so the type of conflict we are looking at in this lesson is man versus man. And the first target I want to look at is I want you to be able to show that you can explain how this man versus man conflict in this short story contributes to its overall plot development. So Mrs. Hopewell and Joy Huggel are going through life. They're both stuck in their ways. They have these, beliefs that they, what is almost like their creed that they live by. And since all stories need a conflict, this story is no exception. It would be really boring if we just sat and watched the characters going along and doing what they do and just eating breakfast in the morning and Mrs. Freeman coming over and everybody's got opinions. It would be boring. So we see conflict pretty much immediately, right in the first paragraph. Mrs. Freeman, the tenant farmer on the property, is described as a truck, and we kind of wonder what trouble that might cause. And in fact, Mrs. Freeman's hulking over her employer's breakfast, it feels menacing. Like, why isn't she invited to eat with Mrs. Hopewell and her daughter? Why does she show up during mealtime and stand at the refrigerator, kind of looking down on them eating? To me, that's got to be some sort of symbolic presence. Is it omnificent? I don't know. Where the conflict really starts to ramp up is when we see this mother and this daughter interact, Mrs. Hopewell and her daughter Joy. In fact, they have such disdain for one another that the daughter, Joy, goes so far as to change her name to what is described as the ugliest name she can find, which is Hulga. And she also dresses and behaves in a way that she knows is irritating and disgusting to her mother. And we're pretty sure she does that on purpose. Mrs. Hopewell definitely believes it's on purpose. Joy Hulga believes she's a superior being because of her intellect. We see that over and over. And Mrs. Hopewell believes she is a superior being because of her worldview, which we know, like, she uses these pat phrases, these cliched phrases that are void of meaning. And then enter Manly Pointer, who shakes up their world and then some. So he plays on the sympathies of Mrs. Hopewell's cliched value system. He plays on Joy Huggle's vulnerabilities, and neither of them figure that out. Neither of them know what's happening. They're so steeped in their superiority that they don't even see Manly Pointer coming. They really underestimate this guy. And I'm going to point out one thing that I didn't write on this slide, but many critics believe that Manly Pointer is supposed to be the personification of evil. He is supposed to represent the devil, if you will. So keep that in mind too as we're discussing. So there are at least 5 possible man versus man conflicts within the short story Good Country People. And I want you to be able to identify at least 2 of those. So there's Mrs. Freeman versus Mrs. Hopewell. There's Mrs. Hopewell versus Joy Hulga. There's Mrs. Freeman versus Joy Hulga. There's Manly Pointer versus Mrs. Hopewell. Manly Pointer versus Joy Hulga. Those are the like man versus man conflicts. There are several other conflicts in the story, such as like intellect over like book smarts over street smarts. There's good versus evil. There are so many conflicts in the story, but because this unit is about, or I should say, this lesson for this unit is specifically pointing out the man versus man conflict, that's what we're going to be focusing on. But I just want you to be able to understand and identify that there are other conflicts in the story as well. So be out of the fact that there are these 5 possible conflicts, just for the sake of this lesson and for the sake of time, you're going to be exploring one of them on your own. But for this lesson, I'm going to be exploring with you this idea that there's this conflict, man versus man conflict between Mrs. Hopewell and her daughter, Joy Hulga. So one way to gain more insight into text is to consult literary criticism. And okay, different, everybody's got different definitions of fun, but this is for me a really fun thing about reading literature is that I can come up with hypotheses on my own and then go and try and find some literary criticism to validate my hypothesis, to make me realize that, hey, it's not just me. I didn't just come up with this out of thin air. Other people have talked about this very thing. For the sake of this lesson, I located and I took notes on just one scholarly article. There were many, but I chose to find out if there were any scholarly articles written about this idea that Joy Hulga and her mom sort of represent themselves in their own minds as godlike, or they deify themselves. And you'll see, I'll talk about that a little bit more here. So I found this scholarly article written by literary critic Fred R. Thiemann, not sure which, and it's called Usurping the Logos, Cliches, and Good Country People. So just the title alone wasn't necessarily what I was after, but when I read through it, um, some of the hypotheses I had come up with were validated. This is what the article kind of looks like when you go into JSTOR. You should be able to get into JSTOR yourself just by signing up with like your Google account. That's what I do, and I just get a free, I think, 100 articles per month or something, and that's plenty. And I just want to prove to you that I did take some notes when I read through the article. I only put the first couple pages of notes here for you just in an attempt to show you what I found in the article. And I think a couple of these are really important to point out before we go further. So we've got this first quote from I think the first page of Thieman's article, and it says, both Joey Helga and her mother will not recognize their limitations. They believe their cliches always disclose being in an absolute way. Now, I would go so far as to say Joy Helga, Joy Helga's belief in being is that there is no being. There, she believes in nothingness, but that's even a deeper thing to go down. Second one, each attempts to define the world, perhaps even create it, by forcing being into a solidified symbol. Mrs. Hopewell believes that the meaningless cliches she mouths give her direct access to the way the world truly is. Oh my gosh, that is so true. She also confuses an exchange of dead aphorisms with communication. She speaks in these aphorisms. She speaks in these like phrases that are just like I've said before, void of any meaning. If Mrs. Hopewell is incapable of any words or thought outside the folk expression she repeats, her daughter is equally incapable of words or thoughts outside the books of such nihilist philosophers as Martin Heidegger. And Heidegger's work comes up within the story in that um, I believe it's the paragraph that Mrs. Hopewell comes across in Joy Helga's book, philosophy book, and she doesn't understand it at all. But I don't know that Joy Helga really understands it the way she thinks she does either. According to Thiemann, such self-deification, this is this idea of that I kind of thought of too, which these women sort of deify themselves, is not only sinful but oppressive. The deified self often desires to subject other selves to its deity. Mrs. Hopewell neatly divides people into categories of good country people and trash. Joy Helga avoids contact with men by formulating them as morons. She fancies she can smell their stupidity. Now, I believe um, she also, I think, believes everyone is a moron. In like for sure, her mom, probably Mrs. Freeman as well, not just men. So I put this Venn diagram on here because I think it's a perfect way for us to juxtapose Joy Helga and Mrs. Hopewell, and we can kind of see where their conflict overlaps in a way that affects both of them. So, as very different as they seem in those white spaces, they are also very similar in that red space, and I'm going to show that in greater detail in just a bit. But I do want to point out how, as I'm reading, I make observations about characters, and then I find things within the text that sort of backs up what I'm thinking. I'm using text evidence. So I've got these observations about Mrs. Hopewell that she speaks in these cliches that don't amount to anything. She is divorced. She's a property owner. I think it is important to point out how it's all female. It's an all female cast until Manley shows up on the scene. She treats her daughter as if she's still a child. She believes her daughter is ugly in her appearance and her behaviors. She stumbles across this paragraph in this philosophy book and doesn't really understand it. But it also makes me wonder if actually Joy Helga even understands it. And then I didn't finish my thought here. I don't know what that was. Mrs. Hopewell believes that girls go to school for a good time, and that's a very different reason than her daughter wants to school. She believes she's superior to others for reasons we aren't really even sure of. I mean, we know she owns property, she employs these tenant farmers. She thinks she has like a grasp on, you know, what the world is based on these shallow phrases. And then she's got this phrase that keeps coming up, good country people. And that is sort of a puzzling philosophy. For instance, if she does believe that Mrs. Freeman is good country people and not trash, why isn't she invited to eat with them? I don't really, I've never really understood that. Something to explore further. And also Mrs. Hopewell is easily duped. She really underestimates Manly Pointer. She's got these ingrained ideas of what is right and what is wrong, and it leaves her vulnerable to Manly Pointer. I thought it was interesting that she's a Christian also who doesn't keep a Bible at home. Joy Hulga is anything but joyful, so I thought that was interesting. She's anything but hoping. She doesn't hope well for anything. The fact that she has a bad heart, I think, is interesting. Um, okay, huge, right? That she's an amputee, that she lost her leg in a hunting accident. Also, a very large part of the story and um, interesting point is that she changed her name to Holga, supposedly one of the ugliest names in existence. She tries to make herself as unpleasant as possible. She stomps around. She's rude. She thinks herself as intellectually superior. She has a PhD in philosophy, which drives her mom crazy because she can't pinpoint it. She can't say my daughter's a teacher, my daughter's a engineer. It's she's a philosopher. And I think there's a phrase, something in there where that went out with the ancient Greeks and Romans. Like there's no such thing as a philosopher anymore. I did put some links to like Malebranche, which is referred to or referenced in the story, as well as the philosopher Heidegger. I think it's important to point out that she lies to Manly about her age. Kind of, was she trying to seem more innocent? I don't know. She is rendered helpless in the end because she loses her leg and her glasses. And then she views Manly as walking on water. I've always thought that is really interesting and somewhere to kind of explore as well, because in the Christian sense, we believe walking on water is something that Jesus did. Is this, obviously something we need to explore. Joy Hoga definitely believes she's better than others, and she doesn't realize how innocent to the ways of the world she really is, which ends up being very obvious when she deals with Manly Pointer. So, as readers, we're going to infer what happens after the story ends. Will Joy Helga suffer great humiliation? She has to be rescued at some point. How is she going to explain how she got into this predicament? All things to note while we're reading. I think what I'm going to do is break this recording into two sessions so that I don't run out of